rights. Section 19 of the Human Rights Act confers a duty on the government to ensure the provisions of this bill are compatible with that convention. Ensuring this compatibility is not only a basic moral requirement for government, it's also a practical necessity, because this government has said this is critical legislation, and therefore they are presenting clauses to this House which they know will probably be ruled unlawful by a court of law. So surely, Mr. Speaker, if the government wants to have a fight with the courts, it should have a fight with the courts and not waste this House's time with this piece of nefarious legislation.
I'm grateful for the point of order. That's not something that the Chair can adjudicate, but I'm sure that it will be part of the debate, which I think we should start now. Home Secretary.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I beg to move that the illegal migration bill be now read a second time. The British public know that border security is national security, that illegal migration makes us all less safe. They know that the financial and social costs of uncontrolled and illegal migration are unsustainable. They know that if our borders are to mean anything, we must control who comes into this country and the terms under which they remain here. That's why stopping the boats is my top priority. It's why the Prime Minister made stopping the boats one of his 5 promises to the British people. And it's why, according to the opinion polls, the British people back this government's bill. They back this government's bill by more than 2 to 1. This does not mean, Mr. Deputy Speaker, as some assert, that the British people are xenophobic. Since 2015, the British people have provided refuge to nearly 500,000 people through global, safe and legal routes. The British people are fair, compassionate and generous. Millions of legal migrants, including my parents, have experienced this warmth firsthand. But the British people are also realistic. They know that our capacity to help people is not unlimited. Since 2018, some 85,000 people...
Secretary of State for Giving Way, does she think the British public want to see pregnant women and children detained in immigration detention centres? I do not believe for a minute that they do, but that's what's in this bill.
The British people want to see people... They want to stop people dying on the Channel. That's what this is about. It's naive to suggest that it's lawful and appropriate to make this journey. People are dying and we need to stop it. Since 2018, some 85,000 people illegally entered the United Kingdom by small boat, 45,000 of them last year alone. They have overwhelmed our asylum system. Local authorities simply do not have the housing or the public service capacity to support everyone. The British taxpayer... To the lady.
I thank the Home Secretary for giving away.
I thank the Home Secretary for giving away.
I thank the Home Secretary for giving way so early in her speech. Is she satisfied personally that there is enough provision for vulnerable children in the proposals that she's putting forward tonight?
It's in detail, but yes, vulnerable people will be receiving appropriate safeguarding and welfare support. The British taxpayer cannot continue to fork out £6 million a day on hotels to house illegal arrivals. Now, let's be honest. The vast majority of arrivals, 74% in 2021, were adult males under the age of 40. The vast majority were not pregnant women. The vast majority were not young children. All travelled through safe countries like France, in which they could and should have first claimed asylum. Many came directly from safe countries like Albania. And when we try to remove them, they turn our generous asylum laws against us to thwart removal. this system...
Thank you. I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. Does she agree that when 70 Labour MPs, including the Leader of the Opposition, signed a letter campaigning for the release of dangerous foreign criminals who we want to remove from the UK, they expose themselves as pro-open borders and unlimited immigration and put themselves on the side of the criminal rather than the side of the public?
Well, my honourable friend puts it very well. What we have here is naive do-gooders who would rather campaign to prevent the removal of a foreign national offender, one of whom went on to tragically kill another, than vote in favour of our measures that would have toughened up the sanctions on foreign national offenders. I'm going to make some progress. The reality is, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is that this system is simply unfair. It's unfair on the most vulnerable. It's unfair on those who play by the rules. It's unfair on the British people. So we must change the law and we must stop the boats. Now, Mr. Speaker, for too long, those of us voicing concerns about the effects of uncontrolled, unprecedented and illegal migration have been accused of inflammatory rhetoric. But nothing is more likely to inflame tensions than ignoring the public's reasonable concerns about the current situation. The public are neither stupid nor bigoted. They can see firsthand the impact on their communities, and it's irresponsible to suggest otherwise. And speaking of acting responsibly, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I want to put something on the record. It's perfectly respectable for a child of immigrants like me to say that I'm deeply grateful to live here, to say that immigration has been overwhelmingly good for the United Kingdom, but that we've had too much of it in recent years. And to say that uncontrolled and illegal migration is simply bad.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend. Does she agree with me that in the last couple of years, where we've seen exponential growth in this human trafficking coming across the channel, that actually what's happening is the money that people who can ill afford to spend on these criminals is being used to make their trade even more effective, putting yet more lives in danger?
My right honourable friend puts it very well. We have now a sophisticated, well-resourced, multi-billion-pound trade of illegal people smuggling and human trafficking. It is pan-national and it needs to stop. But to say, I'm going to make progress. It is, and yet, Mr. Deputy Speaker, despite our reasonable concerns that we have raised on several occasions, like my right honourable friend, the member for Whittam, before me, I am subject to the most grotesque slurs for saying such simple truths about the impact of unlimited and illegal migration. The worst among them, poisoned by the extreme ideology of identity politics, suggests that a person's skin colour should dictate their political views. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I will not be hectored by out-of-touch lefties or anyone for that matter. I won't be patronised on what appropriate views for someone of my background can hold. And I will not back down when faced with spurious accusations of bigotry. Mr. Deputy Speaker, when such smears seep into the discourse of this chamber, as they did last week, accusations that this government's policies backed by the majority of the British people, are bigoted, are xenophobic, or are dog whistles to racists, it is irresponsible and, frankly, beneath the dignity of this place. Politicians of all stripes should know better, and they should choose their words carefully. Mr. Deputy Speaker, those that cast their criticism to this bill in moral terms ignore certain truths. Firstly, they ignore that we have a moral duty to stop the boats. People are dying in the Channel. They are taking journeys that are unsafe, unnecessary, and unlawful.
Point of order.
Sure you'll agree with the Home Secretary that we should all in this debate choose our words carefully. So what part of carefully does her statement about an invasion constitute, and the Right Honourable Lady's exaggeration by the use of the word exponential?
There again, I think on this particular case, it is a matter for the individual person making the speech. All I'm going to say right at this outset, though, is clearly this is a very emotive subject that we're dealing with, and I'd ask everybody to use temperate language rather than inflaming the situation that's already there. We leave it there. Home Secretary.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I appreciate your instruction to all our colleagues. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the way to stop these deaths is to stop the boats. Secondly, the critics ignore that our policy does in fact guarantee humanitarian protection for those who genuinely need it. Our policy is profoundly and at heart a humane attempt to break the incentive that sustains the business model of the smuggling gangs. People pay thousands of pounds to make these journeys to the UK.
For giving way. I, as the Secretary of State probably knows, chair the APPG for freedom of religious belief. We have many people from across the world who are persecuted, discriminated, who are abused physically and have to leave their countries. Some of those, Secretary of State, as you will know yourself, are living in countries, and it's taken so long for their process, for their applications to be, so they can actually get here. I know the Secretary of State probably shares my opinion that it's important that those who are true asylum seekers get their opportunity to come here. Can the Secretary of State assure me and assure this House that those who are persecuted, those who are discriminated, will have their opportunity of coming here for asylum?
Well, we have a very proud and extensive tradition of offering refuge to hundreds of thousands of people who apply according to our system and apply according to our criteria. And I'm very proud of the refuge and security that we've provided to those people fleeing the very circumstances to which he refers. By ensuring, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that people do not remain here, we are removing their incentive to make the journey in the first place. But crucially, if people are truly in need of protection, they will receive protection in Rwanda. Now, critics overwhelmingly fail to acknowledge this fact. Let's be clear. Rwanda is a dynamic country with a thriving economy. I've enjoyed visiting myself twice before, and I look forward to visiting again.
Very grateful to the Home Secretary. Is she also worried that the criminal gangs that are exploiting people in this dreadful way at great profit may also be linked to other types of serious crime and helping finance other destabilisation?
I'm afraid he raises a very worrying fact about what we are seeing. And when I've spoken to police chiefs around the country, what they tell me is that criminality, in particular drug supply and usage, is now connected to people who came here on small boats illegally in the first place. Thirdly, but on Rwanda, Rwanda is a fundamentally safe country, Mr. Deputy Speaker, as affirmed by the High Court. It's got a proud track record of helping the world's most vulnerable, including refugees, for the United Nations. And thirdly,
in Rwanda, people who are same-sex attracted and trans people are not covered by anti-discrimination laws. Does she think that makes it a safe country for gay people and trans people?
Well, I'm sure that my honourable friend has read the judgment from the High Court, which is an exhaustive analysis and an authoritative analysis by senior and learned judges in the High Court, and they look at the compliance of our Rwanda, our world-leading Rwanda partnership with international obligations, including the Convention on Human Rights and the Refugee Convention. It has been deemed to be lawful and a proper partnership, and I refer her to the judgment of the court. I'm going to have to make some progress. I've taken quite a lot of interventions, I'm afraid. Thirdly, Mr. Deputy Speaker, critics like... Go on, one last.
I'm very grateful to the Home Secretary, and I do find it odd that so many members opposite are trying their best to trip her up on a policy which is incredibly important to every community in this country. And, Mr. Deputy Speaker, although they will try and shout me down, let me say that in my constituency of Gloucester, which is a happy, cohesive, multiracial, multi-ethnic society with a primary school of over 50 different nationalities, I know, because I speak to them, that most of the minority ethnic communities are very sensitive to getting this issue of balance right. Because if we get it wrong, the backlash will be felt by them more than anyone else, not by SNP MPs who don't have asylum seekers in their constituency.
Order! Not just temperate language, I want temperate behaviour. Point of order.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful to make this point of order. I wonder if it's possible, if you can maybe advise on how we can correct the record on this really perplexing and fully misleading statement that the member opposite has made, which is profoundly unhelpful in the context of this debate.
To that point of order, Richard Graham.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, no one in this House wishes to cause any offence, and if I have done so, of course I apologise. But in my constituency, we have 2 hotels full of asylum seekers, and I would be very interested to know how many hotels full of asylum seekers that the members opposite.
Order, before we resume, just want to put a couple of points out here. Number one, interventions are now eating into the amount of time that's going to be allotted to people. So people just simply aren't going to get in the debate. That's the first one. And points of order are also doing exactly the same. So all I would caution is make sure that the points of order are for the chair if they are going to be used. And please, the answer is, as you know, that members are responsible for their own contributions, and if anything is said that is untoward, they should correct the record at the earliest opportunity, which I believe Mr. Graham has done. Home Secretary.
Well, can I just agree wholeheartedly what my honourable friend said? He's absolutely right. And if we don't, well, he's right about Scotland, that until recently it was only Glasgow who was taking asylum seekers, and when compared to the other nations of the United Kingdom, they have taken a disproportionately low number. And he's also right in talking, and my honourable friend is absolutely right in talking about the risks that we face as a country, harmonious, happy with ourselves, cohesive. If we don't deal with this problem, then we really will face serious problems about community tension and community cohesion. I'm going to make some progress. I know that a lot of people want to get on, but a lot of people want to make contributions to the debate. Mr. Deputy Speaker, on top of that, the small boats crisis demonstrates that there are there are 100 million people who are displaced globally. That is confirmed by the United Nations. And our critics pretend simultaneously that the United Kingdom doesn't have any safe and legal routes, and that these routes should also be unlimited. The small boats crisis demonstrates that there are countless more economic migrants willing to take a chance to come here in search of a better life. How many of those do the benches opposite think it will take to stop the boats? They haven't been able to provide an answer. Because the reality is, Mr. Deputy Speaker, those arguing for open borders via unlimited, safe and legal routes are of course entitled to do so. But they should do so honestly. They shouldn't try to deceive the public, Mr. Deputy Speaker, by dressing up what is an extreme political argument in the fake garb of humanitarianism. Nor, Mr. Deputy Speaker, nor should they pretend that the UK doesn't have global, safe and legal routes. In recent years, our country-specific routes have provided refuge for 150,000 people leaving autocracy in Hong Kong, 160,000 Ukrainians fleeing Putin's horrific war, and 25,000 Afghans escaping the Taliban. Another 50,000 people have come to the UK via routes open to people from any country. Those include the UK Resettlement Scheme, which includes community sponsorship, the Mandate Resettlement Scheme, and crucially, if someone has a qualifying family member in the UK, the Family Reunion route. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we are proud of those safe and legal routes, and when we stop the boats, we will look to expand them. Now, this bill introduces an annual cap determined by Parliament on the number of refugees the UK will resettle via safe and legal routes. This will ensure an orderly system, considering local authority capacity for housing, public services and support. Mr. Speaker, the illegal migration bill enables the detention of illegal arrivals without bail or judicial review within the first 28 days of detention. We can maintain detention thereafter under current laws, so long as we have a reasonable prospect of removal. This reflects the existing common law position, consistent with Article 5 of the ECHR. The bill places a duty on the Home Secretary to remove The bill places a duty on the Home Secretary to remove illegal entrants and significantly narrows the number of challenges and appeals that can suspend removal.
I thank the Home Secretary for giving way. The last Home Secretary said anyone who arrives illegally will be deemed inadmissible and either be returned to the country they arrived from or a third safe country. They considered 18,000 people inadmissible to the UK asylum system as a result, and just 21 people were returned. That is just 0.1%. What has changed in this bill, and what percentage of those that she deems inadmissible does she expect to return?
Well, I think I've got to also correct the Honourable Lady on a kind of fallacy that she's operating under. We are returning people who don't have a legal basis to be in this country. There are many ways to look at the numbers. Since the Prime Minister's announcement, for example, we've returned 600 people back to Albania. Last year alone, we returned 14,000 people. So it's a fallacy to suggest that there are no returns and that we're somehow not removing people who don't have a right to be here. But moving on, Mr. Deputy Speaker, only those under 18, medically unfit to fly or at real risk of serious and irreversible harm will be able to delay their removal. Any other claims will be heard remotely after removal. Mr. Deputy Speaker, when our world-leading Modern Slavery Act passed, the impact assessment envisaged 3,500 referrals a year. That Act of Parliament was a...
I wonder if my right honourable friend could give a point of clarification. She's implied that people are going to be unable to claim asylum here in the UK and will be removed immediately or at least potentially after 28 days detention. Paragraph 5.1 of the Memorandum of Understanding with Rwanda requires the United Kingdom to be responsible for the initial screening of asylum seekers. Could she perhaps explain what that screening will be if it won't be screening a claim?
Well, we have a very extensive system of screening all of those people who arrive in the UK via small boats. That is effectively what our Manston Centre is designed for. People undergo security checks and biometric checks and any other identity checks. And that screening process is something that we undertake extensively here. Mr. Deputy Speaker, when our world-leading I'm going to have to make some progress. When our world-leading Modern Slavery Act passed, the impact assessment envisaged 3,500 referrals a year. That Act of Parliament was an important step forward in protecting vulnerable people from the abuses of human trafficking and modern slavery. It's something of which I'm incredibly proud. But last year, there were 17,000 referrals, which took on average 543 days to consider. I'll have to give you a moment. The most referred nationality in 2022 were from citizens of Albania, a safe European country, a NATO ally, and a signatory of the European Convention Against Trafficking. In 2021, 73% of people who were detained for removal put forward a modern slavery claim, compared to just 3% of those not in detention. And what we've also seen is a number of foreign national offenders who, after serving their sentences for some of the most despicable crimes like murder and rape, have, on the point of removal, put in a last-minute claim of modern slavery to thwart their deportation. The fact is, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that our modern slavery laws are being abused.
To this exact point, I wonder if the Home Secretary could tell this House how many of that 17,000 increase has been made up of British people, including British children, who until this year made up the largest group of people who have increased in the numbers. So those are British children. Can I also ask her to just point out to the House exactly who makes the referrals into the human trafficking system in our country? Is it in fact under the auspices of her, the Home Secretary, and the Home Office, or can people just claim it? Or is it actually her office who have to say whether they can?
Well, what we've seen is that a large and growing proportion of modern slavery claims have been made by people who have arrived here illegally. And as I just referred to, people who are foreign national offenders, people who have served their criminal sentences, who, upon the point of removal, have put in a last-minute modern slavery claim precisely to thwart their deportation. And also, it is all, we work very closely with local authorities and other bodies to ensure that referrals are made into the mechanism. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this is why the bill will disqualify illegal entrants from using modern slavery rules in this way. Mr. Deputy Speaker, given the mischaracterisation of the bill from members opposite, I'd like to make a few things clear. The Home Secretary's duty to remove will not be applied to detain and remove unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. Consistent with current policy, only in limited circumstances, such as for the purposes of family reunion, we will remove unaccompanied asylum-seeking children from the UK. Otherwise, they will be provided with the necessary support in the UK until they reach 18. With respect to the removal of families and pregnant women, it bears repeating that the overwhelming majority of illegal arrivals are adult men under the age of 40. Removing them will be our primary focus. But we must not create incentives for the smugglers to focus on people with particular characteristics by signposting exemptions for removal. It is right that we retain powers to adapt our policy so that we can respond to any change in tactics by the smuggling gangs. Mr. Deputy Speaker, those critics who say this bill will be found to be unlawful said the same thing about our partnership with Rwanda. The High Court disagreed. Some of the nation's finest legal minds have been and continue to be involved in its development. The UK will always seek to uphold international law, and we are confident that this bill will deliver what is necessary within those parameters. Section 19 of the Human Rights Act requires ministers to give a view on the level of legal certainty on a bill's compliance with the ECHR. This is a unique UK requirement, not part of the ECHR itself. A Section 19(1)(b) statement, Mr. Deputy Speaker, simply means that we are unable to say decisively that this bill is compatible with the ECHR. It is clear that there are good arguments for compatibility, but that some of the bill's measures are novel and legally untested. The benches opposite seem to forget that Section 19(1)(b) statements were made by the Labour government on the Communications Act 2003 and by the Lib Dems for the House of Lords Reform Bill in 2012. It didn't mean that those bills were unlawful, and it doesn't mean that this one is either. Claims that this bill will breach our Refugee Convention obligations are simply fatuous. The Convention obliges parties to provide protection to those seeking refuge. It does not require that this protection be in the UK. Illegal arrivals requiring protection will receive it in a safe third country such as Rwanda. Moreover, Article 31 of the Convention is clear that individuals may be removed if they don't come directly from the territory where their freedom is threatened. Denying access to the UK's asylum system to those arriving illegally from France or any other safe country in which they could have claimed asylum is therefore entirely consistent with the spirit and the letter of the Convention. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the opposition say that this bill cannot work because we lack the capacity to detain all small boat arrivals. We are expanding detention capacity with 2 new immigration removal centres, but clearly we are not building capacity to detain 40,000 people, nor do we need to. The aim of this bill is not to detain people, but to swiftly remove them. Australia achieved success against a similar problem of illegal maritime migration. They reduced annual crossings from 20,000 to hundreds in a matter of months, in large part by operationalising swift third country removals. They didn't need tens of thousands of detention places either. If we can demonstrate to people willing to pay thousands of pounds to illegally enter the UK that there is a reasonable prospect that they will be detained and removed, we are confident that crossings will reduce significantly. Additionally, Mr. Deputy Speaker, arguments that our approach cannot work because Rwanda lacks capacity are wrong. Let me be clear. Our partnership with Rwanda is uncapped. We stand ready to operationalise it at scale as soon as is legally practicable. It is understandable that Rwanda has not procured thousands of beds to accommodate arrivals while legal challenges are ongoing. Yeah.
So the Home Secretary has just admitted that Rwanda doesn't have thousands of places. She will know that the Rwandan government has talked about taking a few hundred people. She will also know that the Rwanda High Court agreement says that cases need to be individualised, and yet she is expecting to find locations for tens of thousands of people expected to arrive this year. She has no returns agreement with France or any other European country. So where is she expecting to send the tens of thousands of people expected to arrive in the UK this year?
She should really read our agreement with Rwanda before she makes a comment like that, because if she did read it, she would see, and if she read the judgment from the High Court, she'd see both that our agreement with Rwanda is lawful and proper and compliant with our international obligations, but also that it is uncapped, and potentially Rwanda could accommodate high numbers of people that we seek to relocate there. Rwanda has the capacity to resettle tens of thousands of people if necessary. Mr. Deputy Speaker, critics of this government's plan to stop the boats would have more credibility if they offered up a plan of their own. Now, the opposition say, let's look at what the opposition plan is. They would increase the funding to the NCA to disrupt trafficking upstream. Never mind that the government's already doubled the funding for the NCA precisely for that purpose. The opposition say that they would go harder on the people smugglers. Never mind that Labour voted against our Nationality and Borders Act, which introduced life sentences for people smugglers. The opposition speak about establishing a cross-channel task force. Never mind that we've already set up a small boats operational command with over 700 new staff working hand in hand with the French. The opposition say that they would get a new agreement with the French. Never mind that just last week our Prime Minister struck a historic multi-year deal with the French to increase the number of gendarmes patrolling the French beaches. The opposition say we should do more with partners around the world. Never mind that this government has returns agreements with Albania, Georgia, Serbia, Nigeria, India, Pakistan and Serbia. And as for our world-leading agreement with Rwanda, well, we all know what the opposition would do about that. They would scrap it. The opposition say that this government can't be trusted with our borders, Mr Deputy Speaker. But the fact is that the Leader of the Opposition and some 70-odd Labour MPs, a third of their parliamentary party, signed letters to stop the dangerous foreign criminals being kicked out of Britain, one of whom tragically went on to kill another person in the UK. A shameful day for the Labour Party. How easy, Mr Deputy, how easy it is for the opposition to say, never mind the British public, believing that they know better, arrogantly, dismissively. The truth is, Mr Deputy Speaker, they don't have a plan, but you know what's even worse? They don't actually care that they don't have a plan. If they listened, they would hear a clear, reasonable and resounding message from the British people. It would be that we like controlled immigration. We welcome genuine refugees, but we do not want uncontrolled or illegal migration. Enough is enough. Stop the boats. That, Mr Deputy Speaker, is the call from the British people. That is their cry for action on all of us who serve them in this place. Mr Deputy Speaker, this is a government that listens. It listens to the people, and aided by this bill, we will stop the boats.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time, and I'm calling Yvette Cooper to move the amendment.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise to move the reasoned amendment in the name of the Leader of the Opposition. Mr Deputy Speaker, most people want to see strong border security and a properly managed and controlled, fair and firm asylum and refugee system. So we have proper grip along our borders, and so we also do our bit alongside other countries to help those fleeing persecution and conflict. That is what Labour believes in. But right now, after 13 years of Conservative government, we have none of those things. Our border security undermined because they let the criminal, smuggler and trafficking gangs rip. And the asylum system in chaos, letting everyone down. And all they can offer is this bill which makes all of those problems worse. Last year, 45,000 people travelled on dangerous small boats, up from just 280 4 years ago. That is criminal gangs making £180 million a year from putting lives at risk. Yet over the same period, convictions of people smugglers have halved. A massive increase in the gangs operating along the Channel, a massive drop in the number of criminals caught. And still refusing to go after the gangs, and the Deputy Chair of the Conservative Party thinking we shouldn't even bother. I'll give way to the honourable member if he will now support our proposals for a cross-border police unit to go after the criminal gangs.
I thank you for giving way. I've actually got another question. I was wondering if the right honourable member would explain to me why it was that the Leader of the Opposition once said when he was a human rights lawyer that there's an undertone of racism in all immigration law. Does he continue to believe that?
Mr Deputy Speaker, immigration law is important, but the problem is at the moment huge amounts of immigration law isn't even enforced. They have had an 80% drop in the number of people who have been unsuccessful in the asylum system and have not been returned, an 80% drop since the Conservatives came to office. Mr Deputy Speaker, at the same time, our asylum system under the Tories is in total chaos. Only 1% of last year's cases have even had an initial decision. Home Office decision-making cut by 40%. The backlog trebled in the space of just a few years, and thousands of people in costly and inappropriate hotels. I will give way.
Grateful to the Right Honourable Lady for giving way. I'm also very grateful to her for the kind comment she made about me in her interview over the weekend and modern slavery work She has just referred to the backlog in asylum cases. If she thinks the current figure means the system is in chaos, then what was her description of the system under the Labour government of which she was a member, which had backlog in asylum cases of between 400 and 450,000?
The former Prime Minister and former Home Secretary is experienced enough to know that is not an accurate characterisation of what happened.
It's not based on your numbers. Based on your numbers.
And that by the time the Labour government left office, the backlog of initial decisions was just a few thousand. Now it is 160,000 and in fact has trebled in the last few years as a result of the complete failure by the Conservative benches. Do you know what? I'm going to have to give way again to the former Prime Minister, because she and I have asked each other questions over so many years that I will have to give way to her again.
I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Lady, but does she not accept that between the late 1990s and the early 2000s, when Labour was in government, the number of asylum cases that were in the legacy, the backlog, rose to between 400 and 450,000?
So the important point that the former Prime Minister addresses is that in the late 90s there was an issue about what happened with the Bosnian refugee crisis and many others, but in fact it was the action that the last Labour government took that got a grip of the system and addressed some of the challenges and took action in order to make sure that we could have both border security and a system that provides for refugees and for those in need of asylum. And what the former Home Secretary will also know, because she was responsible for bringing in the modern slavery law, which I supported when she did, was that this bill also rips up many of the provisions at the heart of that modern slavery legislation. And what I hope she and I would agree on is that it should be possible for our country to have strong border security, to have strong measures and fast, effective measures that at the moment the government does not have to deal with asylum cases swiftly and speedily, and also make provision for those who have fled persecution and conflict and provide support for those who have been trafficked and those who are the victims of modern slavery. And I hope that she will agree with me that this bill does the total opposite of that.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Does she, like me, get really annoyed when she hears members opposite talk about a Labour government from 13 years ago? And does she, like me, wonder why this government, having been in charge for 13 years, continuously likes to look all the way back rather than addressing their own failures?
Well, my honourable friend is right that they have to take responsibility for 13 years in government. 13 years in which we have now seen refugees left in limbo, even though they have fled persecution and conflict, those who are not refugees and have no right to be here, not returned, never returned, an 80% drop in returns of unsuccessful asylum seekers, and at the same time, a 40% drop in refugee family reunion visas, the Afghan resettlement scheme shamefully frozen, and children left with no way to rejoin family. And time and again, ministers just want to blame someone else. All the members of the Conservative Party just want to blame someone else, but they have been in charge for the last 13 years. They keep telling us the asylum system is broken. Well, seriously, who broke it? Mr. Deputy Speaker, we need urgent action to stop the dangerous boat crossings that are putting lives at risk and undermining our border security. But this bill is a con that makes the chaos worse. It won't do the things the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary have promised. It won't stop the criminal gangs or dangerous crossings, and in fact it makes it easier for those gangs as well. It won't return everyone. In fact, it makes it harder to get return agreements. It won't clear the asylum backlog. In fact, it will mean tens of thousands more people in asylum accommodation and hotels. It won't deliver controlled and managed safe alternatives. Instead, it will cut them back. And it will rip up our long-standing commitment to international law. And it will lock up children. It will lock up children, remove support and safe refuges from women who have been trafficked, and it will deny citizenship for people like Mo Farah. The last law that they passed on this just 9 months ago made everything worse. It saw dangerous crossings go up, delays go up, and now they are seriously expecting us to do all the same things again.
The UK was one of the instigators of the 1951 Refugee Convention. That is because before the war, the UK government failed to allow Jews into this country fleeing the persecution of the Nazis. The British Board of Jewish Deputies this week said, today's British Jewish community descended from refugees. We have significant concerns of potential newly proposed migrant legislation to breach the Refugee Convention. Do you not agree with me that we could be in breach of the Convention if we pass this today and be in breach of international law and our own legacy in this area?
Well, my honourable friend is right, and these are damning words we've heard from the Board of Deputies and from many other organisations about the impact that this legislation will have. And at the heart of it, there is a con, because the Prime Minister has pledged that anyone who arrives in the UK without the right papers will be detained and swiftly removed. No ifs, no buts. But where to? So not to France, because the Prime Minister failed to get a returns agreement, failed with other countries as well. And this bill makes it harder to get return agreements because it undermines compliance with the international laws and standards that those other countries are committed to uphold. Standards that we used to be committed to uphold as well. Nor to Rwanda either. The Home Secretary has admitted already that that is failing. The taxpayer has already written a £140 million cheque. The Home Office says it is unenforceable with a high risk of fraud and no evidence of a deterrent effect. The Israel-Rwanda deal increased trafficking rather than reducing it. At most, the Rwandan authorities say they might take a couple of hundred people, but 45,000 people arrived last year. And the Immigration Minister shakes his head, but he said in a statement in December in this House the initial promise was to receive 200 people and that the further preparations had not been made. I will give way first to my honourable friend.
I'm very grateful, and I'm also pleased with the moderate way that she is putting a very sound argument in absolute contrast to the rhetoric that we got from the Home Secretary. She hits, I think, a really important nail on the head. On the front of the bill, we have the statement of the Home Secretary that she cannot certify that the provisions of the bill are compatible with Convention rights. And yet, a schedule of the bill, countries or territories to which a person may be removed include fellow signatories of the European Convention on Human Rights. What legal advice has she seen that we will be able to do that, or that they will accept returns from the United Kingdom?
Well, my own friend makes a really important point, because in order to have cooperation, be it on return agreements, be it on alternative arrangements for processing, all of those things, there needs to be proper standards in place. And those have to be standards that other countries will respect in order to make agreements with us. And therefore, pulling away from the European Convention on Human Rights makes those agreements more difficult, despite the fact that, in fact, it's having those international agreements in place that is one of the most important things to dealing with the challenges we face. I will give way to the honourable member and I will give one.
I'm grateful to her for giving way. Does she share my deep concern about the placeholder clause 49 that seeks to legislate to ignore ECHR interim orders lodged against this government's inhumane, morally abhorrent plans in order to get round the fact that what the government is doing is not compatible with our convention obligations? Does she agree that that actually will undermine our global standing and make it that much harder to make any kind of returns agreements or anything else, as she describes?
Hear, hear.
Well, I think this adds to really the chaos that there is within this piece of legislation, that the government hasn't even worked out what it is that it wants to do, and as a consequence of which is undermining our reputation to be the kind of country that stands up for the rule of law and that leads the way in expecting other countries to follow the law and other countries to do their bit as well. I give way to the honourable member up there who's been very patient. I will then make some more progress before I take further interventions, because I am conscious, Mr Deputy Speaker, of the time.
Shadow Home Secretary for giving way, and as is her right, she's outlining her objection to this piece of legislation. She asked my honourable friend, the member for Ipswich, whether he would back her proposals. Could she do the House a favour and actually outline her proposals, or is this another example of her consistently opposing but not coming up with any fresh ideas for herself?
Indeed, very happy to. I hope that the honourable member will support our proposal for a cross-border police unit in order to go after the criminal gangs and get those convictions up which have totally collapsed on the Conservatives' watch. I hope too will support our proposals for a fast track for Albania and other safe countries, which again the ministers are not doing. Well, this is interesting because the immigration minister says, oh, we're already doing it, except that they're not. Except that they're not. Only 1% of the cases from Albania have been decided. In fact, the Home Office is not taking fast-track decisions on safe countries like Albania. For all of the promises they made, even where they have the powers to take action, they're not doing it. I hope he will also support our proposals to work on not just return agreements with France and other countries, but also family reunion arrangements and reforms to resettlement schemes in order to make those work as well. But instead what we've got is a bill which is a bill which actually will make things worse. Mr Deputy Speaker, we've been clear that the Home Secretary has nowhere to explain that she is going to return people to. And last year, they made exactly the same promises when they said 18,000 people would be inadmissible because they had travelled through safe countries, yet just 21 people were returned. Of those that the Home Secretary said were inadmissible, just 21 are returned. Now she wants to say that everyone is inadmissible, but if she still has just 0.1% of those that she actually manages to return, the reality is she will have tens of thousands of people who she is simply creating a con, creating misinformation and conning all of those on her backbenches who have been cheering for the things that she says and then will see it unravel in practice. Now, the Home Secretary says it means that she can return people to designated safe countries like Albania. She can do that already. She doesn't need this law to do that. She's already got the power to fast-track Albania in other cases. We've been calling for it for months. The UNHCR proposed it 2 years ago. The Prime Minister even promised it before Christmas, but it is not happening. 99% of those cases are still in limbo. And just 15 people who had previously arrived in small boats were returned last month. That is the equivalent of 180 a year, when over 10,000 people came from the designated safe country of Albania. The real problem is that Home Office ministers, Conservative Home Office ministers, just don't have any grip on the system that they are supposed to be in charge of. I will give way to the honourable member, but I have one more and then I need to make some progress.
Shadow Home Secretary giving way, Mr Deputy Speaker. My focus goes back to what was already mentioned, which is clause 49, which is looking specifically at interim measures from the Strasbourg Court, which we know have no actually effect in UK law, but UK courts may take them into effect when they're passing their own judgments. Would the Shadow Home Secretary and the Labour Party support me in wanting to see this particular clause beefed up and actually making sure that the Home Secretary is under a statutory duty to remove unlawful migrants?
Well, I think he perhaps should have put that question to the Home Secretary, because he appears to disagree with his own Conservative government policy and be off on another bit of freelancing for himself. further undermining, I would say, any possibility of getting international agreements, whether it's on returns or anything else. He is planning to make it even harder to get the kinds of returns agreements we need and to get the kind of international cooperation we need as well. Ministers say they plan to lock everyone up before they are returned, and the bill says everyone is included. Children, unaccompanied teenagers, pregnant women, torture victims, trafficking victims, people like Afghan interpreters or young Hong Kongers who we promised to help, locked up because they arrive without the right papers. Now, the Home Secretary hasn't said where or how long for. It's possible at RAF Scampton, although the Tory members for Gainsborough doesn't want that, possibly at MOD Weatherfield, but the Tory member for Braintree, her cabinet colleague, the Foreign Secretary, also doesn't want that. There might, in other circumstances, be pressure on the Home Secretary to put it in her own constituency, except for the fact that she doesn't actually have one right now. I will give way to the honourable member.
If you are a responsible opposition, you have to have a plan. We all agree we've got to stop these boats. Their plan appears to be to process asylum applications even more quickly, so more people will come, or process them in France, where an unlimited number want to come, or this ridiculous idea of a cross-border police force. Everybody knows that, on average, you get caught once on the beaches by the French police. You are not detained, you come back the very next night. They all get there. She knows perfectly well that the only way we're going to stop these boats is the government plan and to detain them and to deport them to Rwanda.
Yeah. All 200 of them. All 200 of them.
The honourable member is just kidding himself if he thinks any of the government's plan is actually going to happen. If he thinks that it's actually going to work. Clause 9, Mr Deputy Speaker, Clause 9 says what happens to all of these people who cannot be returned, to the tens of thousands of people who will arrive, are expected to arrive, according to the government, since the 7th of March. What will happen to them? Clause 9 says the Home Office will provide them with accommodation and support. In other words, they will go back into asylum, accommodation and hotels, but they just won't ever get an asylum decision. So tens of thousands of people every year will be added to the Home Office backlog, only this is going to be a permanent backlog that they aren't ever even going to try and clear. Those who would have been returned after their asylum claim was refused now will not be. And those who would have been granted sanctuary will be stuck in limbo instead. Tens of thousands of people just added to the asylum backlog, costing billions of pounds more, up to £25 billion over the next 5 years. And as for that backlog the Prime Minister promised to clear, it's going to get worse, not better, because effectively all they've concluded is that the Tory Home Office is so rubbish at taking any asylum decisions on time, they've decided to just stop doing them altogether, and they are hoping that no one will notice. And Mr Speaker, Mr Deputy Speaker, last week I said that the government might have decided not to call this an asylum system anymore, but everyone was still going to be in the system nevertheless. Well, I got that wrong, because I've read the explanatory notes again, and it says subsection 2 amends section 94 of the 99 Act so that the term asylum seeker covers those whose asylum claims are inadmissible by virtue of Clause 4 of this bill. So, in other words, they're amending the law so that all the people who they are going to exclude from the asylum system are still going to be called asylum seekers after all, and still going to be in the asylum system. So you couldn't make this up. More chaos, more people in the asylum system, even fewer decisions taken, more people detained with nowhere to detain them, and more people stuck in limbo, and no one credibly believing that any of this is going to act as any kind of deterrent to any of the criminal gangs at all. They are chasing headlines, but it's all a huge con. And what is the price of that con? What is the price of those empty headlines, of cancelling asylum decisions rather than getting a grip? They're damaging our international standing and our chance of getting new cooperation agreements to tackle the problems and our commitments to the rule of law, saying Britain uniquely won't take asylum decisions, yet expecting other countries to keep doing so.
saying that Britain uniquely won't follow the Refugee Convention or the Trafficking Convention or the European Convention on Human Rights, yet urging other countries to follow them. And think too of the price for the people we promised to help, for the Afghan interpreters who worked for our armed forces but who missed the last flight out of Kabul, and who the government told to find an alternative route. If they arrive in the UK now, the Conservatives plan to lock them up, keep them in limbo, and treat them as forever illegal in the country that they made huge sacrifices to help. Or the Ukrainian family who travelled here via Ireland, as I know some people did in the early days of the conflict, without the right papers. It could have been the family staying with me or the family staying with the immigration minister. I've listened to teenagers talking about how they had 20 minutes to pack before they fled their homes, not knowing if they would ever return or see friends and family again. But under this law, those teenagers who arrived with the wrong papers would be locked up, denied any chance to ever live or work here lawfully in the future. That is the Tories' position. So in the interests of a plan that is actually a con and that won't even work to deter the criminal gangs, won't even work to remove people because they don't have the returns agreements in place, will make it harder to get those returns agreements. In exchange for that con that makes nothing any better, they believe that no one who arrives in Britain without the right papers in their hands should ever be able to seek protection here or live here, no matter what their personal circumstances. Now consider what I will give way, but then I will make comments.
I'm most grateful to the Right Honourable Lady for giving way. Which parts of France are such that people need to flee from France to seek refuge in this country?
Well, as the honourable member will know, the majority of people who are seeking asylum, who arrive in France, stay in France rather than seeking to travel to the UK. But we believe that we should be seeking to get a returns agreement with France alongside new arrangements on things like family reunion. But at the moment, the government has so undermined its relationship with France and other European countries that it has totally failed to get any of those agreements in place, and it is making it harder with this bill. So if he believes that returns agreements are needed, if he believes that new alternative arrangements around family reunion or other things are needed, he should oppose this bill, because this bill will make it harder to get any of those agreements in place, because it is undermining international cooperation and international law that all of those other countries depend on. So consider what it means for the young Vietnamese woman who has been trafficked into sexual exploitation, repeatedly raped and beaten by criminal gangs who brought her here and who control and dictate her life. Under this bill, if the police find her when they bust the brothel, she won't be able to get modern slavery support anymore, won't be able to go to a safe house or get help from the Salvation Army. Instead, she'll just be locked up in one of the Home Office detention centres. If she cooperates with the police for a bit, she might get some temporary support. But if that police investigation is closed, her world comes crashing down again. And here's what the Prime Minister tweeted about all of that. If you come to the UK illegally, you can't benefit from our modern slavery protections. You will be denied access to the UK's modern slavery system. Now think on that. Bringing people into the UK illegally in order to control and exploit them is exactly what trafficking is. Cross-border trafficking is, by definition, a major form of modern slavery. Yet this government is just proposing to wish it away, to exclude it entirely from the modern slavery system, as if the very fact of crossing borders somehow stopped it being slavery at all. The message from the UK government to the criminal trafficking and slavery gangs is this: don't worry, so long as you bring people into the country illegally, we won't help them. In fact, we will help you. That is their message to the criminal gangs. We will help you. We will threaten those people
with immediate detention and deportation so that you can increase your control over those trafficking victims. This bill is a trafficker's charter. Modern-day slavery? The previous British Prime Minister, but three, promised to end it, and I respect the work that she did. But this one, the current one, wants to enable it. How low have the Tory party fallen? And it is even worse for children. This bill allows the Home Secretary to lock them up indefinitely, safeguards all removed. It allows her to remove unaccompanied children without even considering the details of their case and whether they have fled from persecution. And once they hit 18, it requires her to remove them, even if the only family or support that they have in the entire world are here in the UK. And even if they have been exploited and abused by criminal gangs. And it denies them any protection from modern slavery. It makes them forever illegal in the UK.
Does the Shadow of Home Secretary share my concern, but it wasn't pre-legislative consultation with the Children's Commissioner before this legislation was brought forward? Why do you think it was the case?
My honourable friend is right, and the Children's Commissioner, I think, is appalled by some of the measures in this bill and the lack of consultation as well. Because remember those hundreds of children missing from asylum hotels? The ones who've almost certainly been picked up by the smuggler and trafficking gangs. This bill makes it even harder to get those kids back, makes it even easier for those gangs to increase their control. It means no sanctuary or just temporary support at most for Eritrean girls who will most likely have been raped or exploited, or for the 12 and 13-year-olds that I met a few years ago brought here by gangs from Afghanistan, or for children who endure what happened to Mo Farah. They would be denied refuge. They would be denied citizenship. They would be locked up and threatened with return. The Home Secretary may not want to admit it, but that is what this bill does. It denies citizenship forever for people like Mo Farah. The Tory party once voted to introduce safeguards on the detention of children, and they were right to do so. The Tory party once voted to introduce the modern slavery bill, and they were right to do so. But what has happened to them now? How low have they fallen, and how far down are they trying to drag our proud country? Because that is what this is. It is an attempt to drag our whole country down. They know this bill won't work to stop boat crossings or to stop the gangs. They know it won't clear the backlog. They know it will make the chaos worse. They know it will stop children and trafficking gangs getting help and play into the hands of criminal gangs. And they know it will undermine our reputation in the eyes of the world as a country that believes in the rule of law. But they don't care. Because this is about political gains. This is about a lame Prime Minister making promises that he has no intention of keeping. All he wants is a dividing line. All he wants is to pick a fight. And all he wants is someone else to blame. And he doesn't care if our international reputation or some very vulnerable people pay the price. I give way to the honourable member.
I'm grateful to the right honourable lady for giving way. Will she accept that there will be many on this side of the House, me included, who will vote for this bill this evening, but with the clear understanding that we wish to see amendments to it as it progresses through Parliament, in particular relation to women who are trafficked and to children. So our votes are being given on good faith tonight, in the expectation that the bill could be amended. Does she accept that?
Mr Deputy Speaker, I do recognise that there are members on the benches opposite who are deeply troubled by many of the measures in this bill. I do recognise that, and I think that does reflect quite how far I believe the Conservative Party has fallen, and I am sorry that that has happened. This is, I think, about an area we should be able to build consensus, not division. In past eras, there has been consensus, for example, on support for Syrian refugees, go back generations on support for the kinder transport. There has been that support in place. We've also had past consensus about the kind of practical, sensible measures around border security as well. I believe it should be possible to build that consensus, and we would work with the government to do that. But that is not what we are getting from the Conservative Party, the Conservative government, the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary. Instead, we have got a Home Secretary who's quite happy to ramp up the rhetoric rather than ever build a calm consensus around a practical plan that sorts things out. And how desperate does it become if what you're doing is ramping up hostility and hatred towards the victims of trafficking and slavery? That is not leadership. Britain is better than this. Mr Deputy Speaker, Labour will vote for action to stop the gangs and to prevent these dangerous boat crossings. We'll vote for a new cross-border police unit, for fast-track decisions and returns, to clear the backlog and end hotel use, for new agreements with France and other countries on returns, on family reunion, on reforming resettlement. We will vote for action that rebuilds border security and restores a properly functioning, credible asylum and refugee system that is properly controlled. But we will not vote for more chaos. We will not vote for a traffickers' charter that lets criminal gangs off the hook, that fails to tackle dangerous boat crossings and that locks up children and leaves some of the most vulnerable people undermined. We won't vote for this bill tonight.
The original question was that the bill be now read a second time, since when an amendment has been proposed as on the order paper. The question is that the amendment be made. Theresa May will get 6 minutes, then we're on to the SNP spokesperson, and then there will be 2 others at 6 minutes. It will drop immediately to 3 minutes in order that we can get as many people in. Theresa May.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Having been Home Secretary for 6 years, I understand the pressures to deal with illegal migration. In my day, people were getting into the backs of lorries and the backs of cars of British tourists returning across the border at Calais. I did a deal with the French, the numbers went down. I have to say I suspect it is partly because of the success of that policy that we now see people coming in small boats. I welcome the new deal which has been done with France because it will have an impact. But what should be clear from this is that whenever you close a route for migrants, whenever you close a route, the migrants and the people smugglers find another way. And anybody who thinks that this bill will deal with the issue of illegal migration once and for all is wrong. Not least because a significant number, if not the majority of people who are here illegally, don't come on small boats. They come legally and overstay their visas. As well as working to reduce illegal migration, I, as has been mentioned, introduced the Modern Slavery Act. That was world-leading legislation. It dealt with traffickers and people who were being enslaved here in the United Kingdom, British citizens. But it was never just a bill about slavery in the UK. As we saw with the prosecution of a British woman under that act for trafficking women from Nigeria to Germany. And I must say there has been some loose talk about people smuggling and human trafficking and using the 2 terms in the same breath as if they're the same. They're not. They're 2 separate crimes. Someone paying their own money to be smuggled across the border is not a victim of human trafficking, which includes coercion, exploitation. Nobody wants to see our world-leading legislation being abused, but the government has to set out the clear evidence if they are saying there is a link between that and the small boats. And so far, I have not seen that evidence. And remember, nearly 90% of modern slavery claims are found to be valid. Now, that doesn't include recent applications, but I think that figure should give cause for concern. I'm concerned that the government has acted on Albania and the Nationality and Borders Act. Neither has been in place long enough to be able to assess their impact. I don't expect government to introduce legislation to supersede legislation recently made, the impact of which is not yet known. But beyond those issues, I have 3 main concerns with the bill. The first is the blanket dismissal of anyone who is facing persecution and finds their way to the UK, but illegally. Examples have been given, but a young woman fleeing persecution in Iran, for example, would have the door to the UK shut in her face. The UK has always welcomed those who are fleeing persecution, regardless of whether they come through a safe and legal route. By definition, someone fleeing for their life will more often than not be unable to access a legal route. I don't think it's enough to say we will meet our requirements by sending people to claim asylum in Rwanda. And this matters because of the reputation of the UK on the world stage. And that matters because the UK's ability to play a role internationally is based on our reputation, not because we are British, but because of what we stand for and what we do. My second concern relates to the implications for modern slavery. I'm grateful to the fact that Number 10 has offered to discuss this with me, and I hope we can find some resolution. But as it currently stands, we are shutting the door on victims who are being trafficked into slavery here in the UK. If they come here illegally, they would not be supported to escape their slavery. And the Home Office itself recognises the damage this bill will do. In the explanatory notes, they make the point about the clauses 21 to 28 on public order disqualification. These provisions are subject to a sunsetting mechanism so that they can be suspended should the current exceptional illegal migration situation no longer apply. In other words, we know this isn't ideal, but we've got lots of people coming illegally, we've got to do something, so the victims of modern slavery, if you like, will be collateral damage. I welcome the acknowledgement that this part of the bill could be reversed, but it could also then be reinstated. The Home Office knows this bill means genuine victims of modern slavery will be denied support. And my third concern is one that has been echoed by other former Home Secretaries of both major parties, namely, will it work? For this policy to work, it seems a number of things have to fall into place. There has to be no possibility of successful legal challenge. It requires the provision of extra detention capabilities and the assurance that no one will be able to abscond. It requires the individual legal cases relating to deportation to Rwanda to be resolved in the government's favour, Rwanda to process more than the fewer than 250 asylum claims they process currently every year, to provide extra accommodation and accept the many thousands of extra people, and agreements on returns with countries around the world, and then the ability to ensure those returns. Dealing with immigration is never easy. There's never a simple answer to any problem, and it's never possible to take one's eye off the ball. It requires constant vigilance, but also international cooperation. The government... I will give way.
I'm very grateful. I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising the case of human trafficking. I conducted the Court of Appeal case with regard to an unduly lenient sentence. We got that sentence increased. It is vitally important that everybody understands the difference between trafficking and between trafficking people smuggling. If we don't get basic terms like that right, how on earth are we going to get this policy right?
Can I say to my right honourable friend, I'm very grateful for the work that he did and for his recognition of the difference between people smuggling and human trafficking. It is imperative that we use careful language in relation to these issues and that we recognise that what this bill does is remove support from the victims of trafficking and modern slavery. The government is working hard, I know, to find a solution to the problem of small boats. But I think there are a number of reasons which shed doubt on the approach being taken. I look forward to working with them on this issue to ensure we can deal with the problem of dangerous sea crossings, can save people's lives, but at the same time, maintain our reputation as a country that welcomes people fleeing persecution, and crucially, maintain our reputation as a world leader in dealing with modern slavery.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. This refugee ban bill is nothing but an abhorrent dog whistle, and my colleagues and I on the SNP benches do not support it. What we do support is the Refugee Convention, the European Convention on Human Rights and the Human Rights Act, and we support a functioning and fair immigration system, which is a million miles away from what we have just now. There is a mosaic based on a Norman Rockwell painting that hangs in the United Nations. It features the faces of people of all backgrounds and is inscribed with the caption, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." It's called the Golden Rule. Britain fails completely and utterly in the application of this Golden Rule. I ask members here and everybody listening to close their eyes for a minute. Place yourself in the shoes of a person so terrified that they must flee for their lives. A person of faith, perhaps, who finds themselves in the wrong country. a woman activist facing repression in Iran, a mother desperate to protect her daughter from FGM, a boy hiding after seeing his family murdered, facing forcible recruitment or death. You leave the world you know, travel across mountain and desert, in trucks, in cars, on feet, bleeding and sore. You face setbacks, abuse and exploitation. You use every resource you have. Finally, you step on a flimsy dinghy because the only way to cross the English Channel to the uncle that you know still lives in the UK, he's the only family member you have who is still alive. There is no other route. And when you arrive so close to him, what happens? You're seized, you're imprisoned, you're not permitted access to a lawyer, you're not given the chance to plead your case. You're whisked away from the sanctuary which is so close you can almost touch it. For this Tory government is prepared to ignore the plight of this persecuted person of faith, these women, this child, and so many others in circumstances like them. They will have no chance of ever finding sanctuary in the UK. The door is closed permanently. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This bill is being rushed through with no proper impact assessment on the back of legislation that is barely even in place, barely even cold from last year. And Mr Deputy Speaker, the Home Secretary declares clearly on the front page of this legislation, I am unable to make a statement that, in my view, the provisions of the illegal migration bill are compatible with convention rights, but the government nevertheless wishes the House to proceed with the bill. It is the illegal migration bill, not legal, not just, incompatible with the Human Rights Act 1998, which gives effect to the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, ECHR, as much as they would have you believe it, it's not a bureaucratic creation, but a system championed by Winston Churchill, where one of its key drafters was David Maxwell Fyfe, a former Conservative Home Secretary and one of the prosecutors at Nuremberg. It is bang on form for a UK government which has previously sought to break international law in specific and limited ways. But this bill is even more dangerous than that. It undermines the fundamental international obligations which their predecessors established under the 1951 Refugee Convention following the horrors of the Second World War. UNHCR have condemned the bill, stating the legislation, if passed, would amount to an asylum ban, extinguishing the right to seek refugee protection in the United Kingdom for those who arrive irregularly, no matter how genuine and compelling their claim may be, and with no consideration of their individual circumstances. I'm sure we've all been inundated with briefings and from contacts from constituents and organisations on this despicable piece of legislation, and I will try my best to try and reflect the many concerns which have been raised with me. But overwhelmingly, I would like to thank the constituents of Glasgow Central, who, as one would expect from the city that gave us the Glasgow Girls, the Glasgow Grannies and the neighbourhood solidarity of Kenmure Street, they are resolutely opposed to this cruel bill. Mr Deputy Speaker, this bill is unfair in many respects, but particularly so by having retrospective effect. Parliament has only just begun the process of debating this hideous legislation, yet it will impact people who arrived from the 7th of March when the bill was introduced. People cannot yet know for certain what this bill will look like, yet they are already severely impacted by it. The provisions which affect children in this bill are amongst the more disturbing parts of a very bad piece of legislation. Clause 3.2 states that the Secretary of State may make arrangements for the removal of a person from the United Kingdom at a time when the person is an unaccompanied child. An unaccompanied child, do unto others as they would have them do to you. Children's Commissioner Bruce Adamson has stated his clear opposition to this bill. The UK is required to ensure that children seeking refugee status receive appropriate protection and humanitarian assistance under Article 22 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. The UNCRC also requires the UK to ensure that children are protected from exploitation and abuse and afforded support for recovery. This bill violates those obligations and many others. Its enactment would place the UK in clear breach of its international law and obligations under a range of human rights treaties, says Bruce Adamson. This bill reaches into Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland too in sections 15 to 18, seizing powers to undermine clear protections that we have established in our devolved institutions to protect all Scotland's wains. Bernardos have rightly queried why the bill seeks to give the Home Office the power to accommodate children when there are currently hundreds of children missing from Home Office accommodation and unaccounted for. They also want to know whether an unaccompanied child who's arrived in the UK irregularly would be routinely placed into specialist foster care as a matter of policy or be eligible for adoption. They ask whether if two siblings are trafficked into the UK, where one is 12 years old and the other is 18, will the bill essentially mean that both will be detained and removed from the UK and denied any protection? And if an unaccompanied child is trafficked into the UK and is granted protection through the national referral mechanism, and a family member who they may not even have ever met arrives in the UK irregularly at a later point, does that then disqualify the child's modern slavery protection? This whole area is deeply problematic, and even more so as the bill allows for removal as soon as an unaccompanied child does turn 18. As is clear, the current inadmissibility rules from the Nationality and Border Act do not work. Expanding inadmissibility creates a situation where there is no right of appeal, do not pass go, do not collect a meagre £8 a week in an overcrowded hotel, go directly to immigration jail and wait a removal. There are some very tight grounds for a technical appeal, but the potential for people being removed to places where they will be at risk of persecution is real. I would love to know what how the Home Secretary will know the details of a person's claim if it is not going to be fully assessed. The bill talks in clause 6 about the potential for a person to be at risk of persecution for their sex, their language, their race, their religion, their nationality, their membership of a social or other group, political opinion, or any other attribute or circumstance. The Home Secretary is appropriate. Yet if there is no application, declaration, no assessment, no ability to seek legal advice, and a presumption of inadmissibility, how will she know? The former Member of Parliament, the former Prime Minister, the member from Maidenhead, who I often disagreed with when she was Home Secretary and Prime Minister, is correct to be concerned about many of the mechanisms in this bill. It is beyond all logic and reason that the Home Secretary should rip up these important protections. The legislation also overrides the Human Trafficking and Exploitation Scotland Act 2015 against our will. ILPA have said that clauses 21 to 28 concerning modern slavery and trafficking clearly breach the UK's obligations to victims of trafficking under Article 4 of the ECHR and the European Convention on Action Against Trafficking. These provisions will deprive victims of their right to recovery, expose them to re-exploitation and facilitate the work of trafficking gangs. And I have met people that have been supported through the TARA organisation in Glasgow. I have seen how damaged some of those people have been, and it breaks my heart to think that this government would lock them up and give them no support whatsoever. Amnesty International have stated that this bill creates a charter for human exploitation, placing many of the most marginalised people firmly in the hands of human traffickers, modern-day slavers and other abusers. It widens the power imbalance between those being abused and their abusers, and it makes it far, far more difficult for those people ever to break free. The risk of now doing so is that they are removed from the UK permanently, and their abusers, you can bet, will use that threat over them. Why on earth would the Home Secretary consider this a sensible idea? The clauses on entry into and settlement in the United Kingdom are brutal. There is no entry, there is no chance of settlement, permanently and forever. A person can never enter the UK if they once met the 4 conditions the Home Secretary is setting for legal entry, or indeed if they are a family member of that person. So talk about holding the child accountable for the sins of the father. This applies, I understand, even if the child was born here. And this will surely also have the wider impact of hitting people well into the future who may wish to come as tourists, to work or to study. They may have no knowledge of that previous banning order. So why would the Home Secretary wish to deny that opportunity? What message does she think it sends out into the world, this pulling up of the drawbridge? Clause 51 outlines the capping of safe and legal routes. Now, these proposed routes are to be brought forward in regulations, and the Home Secretary is dangling a carrot that this may happen perhaps at some point in the future. Maybe, perhaps, in the fullness of time, when parliamentary time allows. Aye, right. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we need those safe and legal routes now. They are part of the solution to the small boat crisis. Because people coming by that route are doing that because there is no other option. People cannot claim for asylum from abroad. They literally need to place their feet on this island. It is not by some coincidence that there are no Ukrainians paying people to come by dinghy, because they can get on a plane from Poland and fly to the UK without the risk of being returned there. It is cheaper, it is safer, it is humane. The Glasgow solicitors firm McGlashan Mackay mentioned that they were dealing with some people from El Salvador for which there was a visa waiver scheme, so those people could get here safely. The Home Office shut it down. And Afghans do not have the privilege of getting in a plane and coming here. Just 22 people have been resettled in the UK, including 8 children, under the Afghan Citizens Resettlement Scheme via referral from UNHCR. Pathway 2 is the only route open for resettlement for Afghans who are not already in the UK. I will give way.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. She's mentioning safe and legal routes. I'm very keen that we need greater definition on the bill. I'm also keen that we need some greater safeguards for vulnerable children. But she has exclusively, as with the Shadow Home Secretary, focused on extreme cases who may fall foul, and that's why we need those additional criteria added on the bill. She has not, just as the Shadow Home Secretary, made no mention of people who come across the Channel who actually are not genuine asylum seekers, who have no genuine, credible claim to come to the United Kingdom. She seems to assume that everybody coming across the Channel is one of those vulnerable people. They're not. So what would she do about those people genuinely abusing our hospitality?
He knows, and I know, that the vast majority of people that do come over are accepted as asylum seekers, get their refugee status. And he also knows that without those safe and legal routes, the question that he asked to the Home Secretary at the Home Affairs Select Committee remains unanswered. And under this bill, the Home Secretary isn't going to even ask to find out whether or not these people are genuine. Everybody is deemed to be some kind of folk. Returning to the Afghan scheme, which does not work, I spoke on Friday to my constituent Zakia, who has been trying to reunite with her sister since the fall of Afghanistan. Her sister has had the Taliban enter her home and beat her. She has played by the rules, as the Home Secretary set out. It says that people should. She's made an expression of interest, and still nothing. And if the Home Secretary was in this woman's shoes, would she really sit tight in Afghanistan and wait for the Taliban to murder her? Because that is what happens to women in Afghanistan. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Capping these routes that don't even exist right now, would suggest that if you're the X+1 person, well, that's just too bad for you. It's not based in need. A few years ago, I was made aware that the visitor visa scheme for Iranians was essentially being run as a lottery, with names being run for lucky winners. Well, this government couldn't run a raffle, and I don't trust them to establish this scheme in a timely or fair manner. And if he'd like to give me some experience from his constituents of how difficult it is to come from Afghanistan, I'd be glad to hear it.
Thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. She's speaking of safe and legal routes. Given that globally there are over 100 million displaced people, I wonder if she could be kind enough to confirm how many of these people an independent Scotland would take, what tax rises you would make to fund their public services, and how many additional people you're willing to accept in central Glasgow.
If he knew anything at all, he would know that my Glasgow Central constituency has the highest immigration caseload of any constituency in Scotland. And we are proud that that is so. I would like to know how many are actually being housed in his constituency. And I would say as well that Scotland has taken the highest proportion of Ukrainian refugees. We have taken the highest proportion of Syrian refugees. We have a proud history in Scotland, and we would do much, much better than this pathetic excuse for a government over here. Turning, I will give away in just 1 second if you've got. I was going to turn to the practicalities of this bill, because there is no proof that this bill will work, any more than the Nationality and Borders Act worked, any more than the hostile environment worked, because we were told that those things at that time were the solution to the problems that we have. They have evidently failed, because they're back here legislating again. There is no return agreement with the EU or anywhere else, and ironically for the Brexiteers on the benches opposite, leaving the EU has made this much, much more difficult. The bill lists EEA countries and Albania, but a deal doesn't exist. And there are already countries, as we know, around the world where the UK government will not return people, and others where there are no flights and no means of return. What this bill does do is create an underclass of people stuck in immigration limbo indefinitely. The bill will detain everybody arriving in a small boat for 28 days. The UK's current detention capacity is 2,286 beds. The number of people crossing in small boats last year was 45,755. And for context here, the prison population in England and Wales in 2022 was just over 81,000 people. So where on earth does the Home Secretary suggest that the number of people she wishes to detain are kept, as well as those that are deemed inadmissible but unreturnable? Will they be in facilities like Manston with children sleeping on the floor? Yep. In dilapidated and crumbling facilities like Napier Barracks where COVID and scabies were rife? In hotels, which is lining in the pockets of companies like Serco and Mears but costing the government a fortune and putting vulnerable asylum seekers at risk, such as those being housed in Erskine in Scotland where they are being targeted by far-right groups? Or perhaps, I will indeed.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. She's indeed right. Erskine Bridge Hotel is home to, is potentially the largest such hotel in the UK, and we've got another hotel in Renfrewshire, unlike the honourable member for Gloucester. This government and the benches opposite assert that Scotland doesn't play its part. That's clearly not the case. Meanwhile, Patriotic Alternative, the neo-fascist group, are blaming the SNP for these hotels being used in the first place, leading to security threats against my staff. Which agree with me, any members opposite who support anything Patriotic Alternative have said should be thoroughly ashamed of themselves.
I absolutely agree with the sentiments that he shares, and we should all be very worried about the rise of these groups and how they are being fed by the rhetoric of leaders and MPs across the way. Perhaps, yeah, they're laughing over there at this suggestion. It is terrifying and it is scary, and people will get hurt. They should know much better. Perhaps if they can't fit them into more asylum hotels or shabby barracks, perhaps the Home Secretary will place those who have survived war and persecution on the streets and just let them wander the streets, because they will not be allowed to do anything else. The Home Secretary seems to envisage this as some kind of deterrent, but she fails completely to recognise the reasons why people flee. The ties of family and English language that people have, and as the Afghan interpreters have said to me, we are here because you were there. As Enver Solomon, CEO of the Refugee Council, has also said, the plans won't stop the crossings, but will simply leave traumatised people locked up in a state of misery, being treated as criminals and suspected terrorists without a fair hearing on our soil. And all of this, Mr Deputy Speaker, comes at a financial cost as well as a humanitarian, and you would imagine the Conservatives would at least care about that. Around £6 million per day on hotels, including one of my constituents who contacted me today, who's been in a B&B for 20 months, waiting on a decision from the Home Office. Exacerbated all the way by Home Office incompetence, which I see week in, week out at my surgeries. £12.7 million to compensate the 572 people the Home Office detained unlawfully last year. £120 million at least on the failed Rwanda deal. £480 million to France, over the next 3 years, on top of the £250 million already given since 2014. And the Refugee Council estimate it will cost in the region of £980 million to detain people under the scheme proposed in the bill today. It's chucking good money after bad policy, and it is sickening that it costs so much to treat our fellow human beings so badly. My constituent Patricia put it to me so clearly on Saturday. She said, I am not Asylum. I have a name. I'm a human being, and every human being has a right. You don't need to be an exceptional athlete like Mo Farah, Chief Executive of the Scottish Refugee Council like Sabir Zazai, a councillor like Rosa Saleh or Abdul Bastani, or even an Oscar-winning actor like Kehu Kwan. Refugees are entitled to the right to lead an unremarkable life, in peace and safety, to get an education and to provide for their family. It is not asking too much. It is the least anyone could expect. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Mr Speaker, the SNP wholeheartedly and unequivocally condemn this cruel, shoddy, tawdry bill. We urge the government to scrap it and to focus instead on tackling the asylum backlog, which leaves so many of our constituents in a costly and damaging limbo. Lift the ban, let refugees work and contribute as they so wish to do. And it's been telling, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the Labour Party have been so weak in their opposition to this bill as to be played off the park by football pundits, commentators and actresses like Kate Blanchett. My credit to the principled stance taken by Gary Lineker and his colleagues, thoroughly Ken-muring the BBC. And I bet if he tweeted in favour of the bill, he would not have faced the red card-worthy simulation of outrage from the Tory benches. Because it seems if you're a Tory donor, you can run the BBC, but if you oppose this pathetic excuse for a government, they don't want you to work there. Mr Deputy Speaker, Scotland stands against this bill. We would not have such cruel provisions in an independent Scotland. We wish to be known for our kindness and our hospitality and our compassion, not our hard-heartedness and our cruelty. We would do unto others as they would have them do unto us. Say it loud and say it clear. Refugees are welcome here.
6-minute limit on the next two, then 3 minutes. Sir Robert Buckland.
Mr Deputy Speaker, as I listen to this debate, I frankly get more and more depressed. What we hear is artificial juxtapositions between either a position of an open door policy, letting everybody into this country, or a suggestion that on this side of the House we are cruel, we are callous, and that we don't care about people. Now, can I deal with that second point? Utterly wrong. As Justice Secretary, I worked very hard to make sure that the Nationality and Borders Bill was able to make its way through this House. And I yield to nobody in my determination to make sure that those who seek to exploit others and to profit on the back of people who are vulnerable and who clearly are not asylum seekers but are economic migrants must be dealt with. And I think this party should make no apology for wanting to make sure that that issue is addressed fair and square. That's what the people who put us here expect us to do. That's what our constituents want us to do. What our constituents are fed up of, Mr Deputy Speaker, is the seeming inability of the system to enforce the laws that we pass in this place, to get on with the job of lawful deportation, to make sure that people who don't overstay their visas do not stay here. Because as my right honourable friend, the member for Maidenhead said, that is the main cause of unlawful migration, the overstaying of visas. Now that's not to minimise the small boats issue, but it is to put it into context. The small boats crisis, as we describe it, is actually the product of a successful approach that we took when it came to the control of lorries and the appalling incidents that we saw where many people lost their lives as a result of suffocation and other horrors. Now, as a result of that, we plugged that loophole. I'm pretty sure that if we succeed in plugging this loophole, another one will emerge. From all the evidence I know from asylum seekers I speak to in my constituency, and I do so regularly, Mr Deputy Speaker, this is a price-driven market. It is simply cheaper to come on small boats than it is to come here by other means at the moment. And herein lies, I think, the source of the problem. The government is seeking once again to use law where I believe primarily it is operations that matter more than anything. And in particular, the ability of this country to strike sensible agreements with not just France, but other members of the European Union as well, in order to have a managed system of return, a quota system, frankly, that would make eminent sense in dealing with what is an international problem. We came together on Ukraine. Why on earth can't we come together on this? And that would make sense of clause 51, Mr Deputy Speaker, the government's wish to have a debate in this House on a cap or quota. I think that's a sensible measure, but it will only work if we extend safe routes of passage in a controlled and measured way. We've got to do more on safe and legal routes. In fact, doing that would strengthen the government's case against those people who are choosing small boats. It's plain as a pikestaff to me. But that must happen in tandem with this legislation. No good passing this legislation unless we do those other operational things. And just to, in perhaps not second reading tradition, but deal with a particular clause of the bill, clause 3, about the detention of children, which I have great concern about. I know it's a power, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's not a duty. When powers are put into bills, it's usually because the policymakers haven't actually decided what to do and whether to use them. And it's a holding mechanism in order for the government to make a decision. Well, my strong suggestion to them when we come to amendment is to ditch that clause and to look very carefully at the way in which we deal with unaccompanied children, families and women, because there's nothing worse, Mr Deputy Speaker, than ineffective authoritarianism.
My right honourable friend,
and that is the danger of provisions like that, and I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Would my right honourable friend agree that in looking at clause 3, as he said, if the government were to look at clause 29 4b, particularly the phrase compelling evidence, if the government were to bring criteria forward which define compelling evidence, that might reassure a number of us on this side that it will prevent the illegal sex trafficking of young women within the clause of the bill not being allowed to seek provision and protection under the modern slavery bill.
I think my honourable friend is right. It's going to be vitally important that there is clear guidance. I mean, we've been here before. I mean, when it comes to modern-day slavery, there has been a question about the interpretation of guidance. I know that is a vexed question for the government. I know that my right honourable friend, the Minister of State who sits on the bench, is assiduous in these matters. I know we'll want to get it right, but we have an opportunity in committee and that report to do so, because as presented, this bill is not yet in the state that it needs to be if it is, in my view, to have the effect that I think the government want it to have. And can I say about the interaction between this bill and the European Convention on Human Rights? I do hope, Mr Deputy Speaker, that this bill isn't being used as some sort of battering ram to make a wider political point about the validity of the European Convention, because I can tell you, the European Convention is not the problem in this case. And those who think it is are setting up a massive Aunt Sally when it comes to actually what the issues are. Because whether we're in the Convention or not, domestic law and our rule of law tradition and the procedures that we have under various immigration acts, some of which I've been involved with passing in this House, will inevitably impose principles of natural justice upon any process. And the idea that through a blanket approach that somehow we engineer a battle with the courts, a battle with the European Convention is, I think, misconceived. And it is a journey upon which I would urge the government not to embark. There's no need to talk about withdrawal from a convention that British Conservatives wrote. What we need to focus upon relentlessly, Mr Deputy Speaker, in dealing in a grown-up and mature way with a serious situation such as this, is to make sure that internationally our reputation as reasonable actors, as people with whom other countries can do business, as a place where people will want to invest, is enhanced by the approach that we take to these issues. And that is why the tone of this debate is so important. And I'm concerned, Mr Deputy Speaker, that in some of the utterances I hear from my party, that tone is not appropriate. We have to do better. We have to rise to the level of events. We have to get it right.
And Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And just following up on that point on the issue of tone, despite the very strong views held on this piece of legislation, both in this House and outside, by actors, football commentators and archbishops, I do believe there is a consensus that we all want to stop people crossing the channel in unsafe small boats, risking their lives in some of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. And this government's flagship immigration bill underpins one of the Prime Minister's 5 priorities to the British people. And it's so important, that's why I asked the Leader of the House if the Home Affairs Select Committee could carry out pre-legislative scrutiny to test the robustness and the evidence supporting this bill. Sadly, that's not been possible. And it's also disappointing that we haven't had an impact assessment, an equality impact impact assessment or a child rights impact assessment accompanying the publication of the bill. Now, I also hope there's consensus across the House that the UK should, of course, do its bit to support those fleeing persecution and torture, sharing this responsibility with our international partners. And we do need to put this into context. Not every displaced person in the world wants to come to the United Kingdom.
That's right.
And we are not facing an invasion. We know that countries such as Turkey take the lion's share of refugees, and nearly 70% of refugees mainly end up staying in the region they come from. So what exactly should the government be doing about small boats? Last summer, the Home Affairs Select Committee published our report into Channel Crossings. We made the important point in our report there is no one magic bullet that will solve this problem. And as I made clear last week, the Home Secretary is right that our asylum system is broken. But it is not the migrants crossing the channel who broke it. Poor resourcing, antiquated IT systems, high staff turnover of too few staff has resulted in this backlog of 160,000 cases. Tackling the backlog has to be the most important priority for the Home Office. And another key message from our report was the need for detailed, evidence-driven, fully costed and fully tested policy to tackle this problem, rather than simple headline-grabbing announcements such as Rwanda, for which there is still no body of evidence on the potential deterrent effect. Other recommendations included the importance of establishing a returns agreement with the EU, extending family reunion and creating safe and legal routes. We all know that people may travel without papers, using irregular methods, but have a solid case for seeking asylum, which needs to be considered under our international obligations. And this bill currently would deny that opportunity. Positively, at the end of last week, we saw further agreement with the French on tackling small boats, albeit we still need that returns agreement with the EU. And whilst it's encouraging that the government is improving its relationship with the EU, we now find the government stress testing our international obligations and potentially breaking international law. Turning to the specifics of the bill, first of all, the proposals in this bill present a huge logistical challenge for a department not known for good project management or for being on the front foot. It has three essential pillars: detention, deportation and deterrence. Each raise serious and fundamental practical issues that we need clear answers to understand how the bill will work. The Institute for Government have very helpfully summarised the key questions. Number one, does the bill adhere to the UK's international obligations? 2, how does the bill change existing policy on inadmissible claims? 3, where can the government send asylum seekers deemed inadmissible? 4, what does the Home Secretary consider to be a reasonable prospect of removal? 5, what will happen to people the government cannot remove to another country? 6, how will the government accommodate people it has detained, and how will it pay to do so? And 7thly, will it deter people from crossing the channel in small boats? I have very many concerns, particularly on the provisions relating to unaccompanied children, children and families being detained and victims of trafficking and modern slavery. The Salvation Army have stated in their briefing on the bill that modern slavery is not an immigration issue, it's a safeguarding issue. The men, women and children trafficked against their will to the UK and enslaved should not be punished for being victims. But this is what the illegal migration bill will do. Finally, looking at deterrence. On the Select Committee's visit to France earlier this year, we heard evidence that people who've arrived in northern France, having travelled thousands of miles in some cases, will not be put off when they can see the British coastline from the French beach and have little or no knowledge of what the Home Office policy or British law is. That we therefore need to fully understand how this plan for detention, deportation and deterrence will work in practical terms. I'm concerned that the bill potentially leaves the Home Office in a legal quagmire, with up to tens of thousands of people detained for a period and then bailed into a permanent state of limbo, unable to be removed, unable to have their asylum claims processed, and unable to reunite with families. And there is nothing specifically in this bill about tackling criminal gangs, people smugglers and traffickers. Just to conclude, we all want action on small boats, but what we want is effective action that will deal with the problem.
Sir John Hayes.
Countries mean more than their borders. National character, shared heritage and the institutions that give that history life matter. But borders matter too, for they are what mark the territory which defines citizenship with its implicit entitlements and responsibilities, opportunities and duty. And the plain fact is that our kingdom's borders are being breached day after day with impunity. Since 2018, some 85,000 people have entered Britain illegally, 45,000 of them in 2022. 74% are men under 40. 100% have travelled through safe countries to get here where they failed to claim asylum. Accommodating them is costing the British taxpayer every single day £6 million. It cannot go on. Of course, Britain should provide a safe haven for people in need, in genuine need. But it is a deceit to pretend the asylum system has not been gamed and the British people taken for a ride by economic migrants with no legal right to be here, enabled by fat cat law firms who've grown rich on the proceeds, aided and abetted by militant interest groups who are determined to subvert the will of the people, and cheered on by vacuous, self-indulgent celebrities living millionaire lifestyles. It may be uncomfortable for the bourgeois liberal establishment, but polls show that the British people want tough action on illegal immigration. Indeed, polling last week showed that people support the principles of this bill. Mr. Speaker, Benjamin Disraeli said justice is truth in action. Today, the government is giving voice to the true wish of the British people to restore justice to our immigration and asylum system. It is not extreme to want to cap all kinds of immigration. It is not immoderate to deport illegal immigrants. It is not unreasonable to give the government the tools they need to do just that. It is time to take back control of our borders. It is time to stop the votes.
Sir George Howarth.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I have to say the honourable member for South Holland and the Deepings makes a very unlikely class warrior. I'd also perhaps like to say that my right honourable friend, the member for Normanton, Pontefract and Castleford, gave her usual forensic analysis of the situation, and I'm very grateful to her for doing that. And also, I want to agree with the Home Secretary on one thing, and that is when she said we should choose our words carefully. It's just a pity she didn't do so herself. Mr Speaker, the reason I wanted to speak in this debate is that because, as you're aware, there is a hotel in Knowsley with 180 plus asylum seekers. I won't talk about that in detail because I had an urgent question on it a few weeks ago. But what I will say is since then, the situation has deteriorated to the extent that some of the refugees have been verbally abused in the street and others have been assaulted. And they have fled because the countries they come from were unsafe, only to find themselves in an unsafe position in this country. And I think we should all be ashamed. Not just happening in Knowsley, it's happening all over the country about that. I just want to conclude, Mr Deputy Speaker, by saying something about why it is we've got this bill before us in this House. My right honourable friend, the Shadow Home Secretary, convincingly pointed out the failures in the system that have led to this. But why are the government themselves bringing forward a bill that anybody who knows anything about it knows isn't going to work? And the answer is, with some notable exceptions, the Right Honourable Lady from Maidenhead and the Honourable Lady from Romsey and Southampton North, to name but two, Broadly speaking, those on the benches opposite split into two groups. The first group are deluded and actually believe this is going to work. And the second group are cynical and don't believe it's going to work, but they're going along with it anyway. Absolutely. And I think, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that is a shameful set of circumstances. At least those who are deluded will wake up tomorrow morning and think, well, we were still right. Those who are cynical know they'll have to wake up tomorrow morning, look at themselves in the mirror, and ought to be ashamed of themselves.
Matt Waldman. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many in this House want to say that the government is inciting people's worst instincts on immigration. And I want to say ultimately optimistically, that it's not this bill, it's not this Home Secretary, it's not this government that is causing that feeling. In fact, it's in touch with the widespread symptoms of it from people, decent people in constituencies up and down this country like mine. And we have to heed those views. Because the reality is, Mr. Speaker, in my judgment, enough of the fine people of Skegness say accurately that they're already doing a huge amount. They say that asking them to do even more has untold consequences. They say, in short, that endless numbers cannot be made to feel welcome if they worry that the town they are staying in will never be the same again, in part because of it. And when enough people feel this way, Mr. Speaker, we mainstream moderates in this House have to act, because if we don't, we should know that it is the racists and the extremists of the far left and the far right that will take our place. We've already seen Patriotic Alternative march in Skegness. If, however, we act now, there's a chance to stop decent British people from withdrawing their consent. And that's why the aims in tonight's bill are not just compassionate, they're the only compassionate option. They're the most compassionate way, breaking the business model of both people smugglers and indeed those who buy hotels to sell back to the Home Office at profiteers' rates. All of that has to end. But I want to end, Mr. Speaker, by saying this. We do need to have safe routes from dangerous countries. We do need to have provisions for those men and women who are trafficked and for children who are taken by what will then be irresponsible adults to these shores. But we cannot use those hard cases to pretend that we can't do better than where we are today. Because if we don't, compassion will cede the ground to ignorance and to hatred. We have to act, or we will stretch the licence voters give us to act on their behalf beyond breaking point. In Skegness, I'm not exaggerating when I say for some, this is an issue about democracy and the effectiveness of government itself. This bill isn't about just stopping the boats. It's about stopping that democratic tragedy as well. And that isn't just one reason why I will be proud to support it this evening.
Cabinet Mahmood. And I think the words for member for Boston and Skegness best remain to himself and nobody else in this debate, because they don't make any sense or have any delivery for the people that we represent. This country is based on the rule of law. We are in the UN Security Council. We were the writers of the European Convention on Human Rights. We were the main principles in the Geneva Convention, and we also penned the war crimes legislation that is now in existence. And to accuse people here of being lefty lawyers for doing the right thing, to standing up for our rights and for people in law, which is what is enshrined. We've always worked to the letter of the law, and so we should. The Minister, the Home Secretary, takes no advice from the Bar Council, takes no advice from the Law Society, who all say that there'll be a contradiction if this law is to pass and go forward, and will have problems in the courts, as they've already previously had. So they don't want to do anything in relation to that, and that's the problem. There are no safe routes for anybody to come through. Afghanistan's been closed, Hong Kong's been closed, and the Minister nods no. You try from Afghanistan to get anywhere out, and you'll see what the issues are and how you deal with that. There are women that have been trafficked who will have no support from any of these people. There are young children who will be in jeopardy, who will have no support under this bill. This bill is against the people. This bill is against the human rights and civil liberties of people. The Labour Party doesn't say there is an open and free door. That is what you say about the Labour Party. The Labour Party is here to look at open and positive immigration. That's what we want to do. The Home Secretary, in an opening statement, said that she can't be xenophobic or racist just because of her colour and her origins. Well, I say to her, of the same colour and the same origin, that is exactly what her politics are about. Her politics are about dividing our society, our community, based on that. That is what she's doing, and that's what she continues to do. I think the best thing that she can do is to look at what is right for the people rather than making political decisions which she thinks she will win the next election on. That is not the case. The people of the United Kingdom are not so naive as to take this huge nonsense of xenophobia and racism from this party to be put forward. What she needs to understand is she needs to have the milk of humanity to move forward with these issues. We are all here representing all of our constituents. She does not understand that. I certainly hope, for her sake and for the sake of all the people that come through here, that we are responsible for human beings in terms of our humanity and for moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Sir Robert Neal. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I echo the words of my right honourable and learned friend, the member for South Swindon, in saying that we need some calm and seriousness in this debate, and that tone is important, even if it's sometimes been lacking. In that spirit, can we just observe that it is not unlawful or illegitimate, faced with new and novel developments in the means of entry into the United Kingdom, unlawfully to test the legal position. That's what the bill does, no more at this stage. It's legitimate to do that because, of course, as somebody who supports the European, International Convention on Refugees, we have to recognise, for example, that conceived in 1951, at a time when people were smuggled across borders, there was perhaps a little bit of bribery of local officials or some altruistic assistance from people to get over borders. That was beyond a time of organised criminality exploiting vulnerable people. We do have to reflect the reality of that change in circumstance, and the government is entitled, I think, to look at the way in which that might best be done. That's the case for judicial dialogue in Strasbourg. It's also a case for looking at renegotiating some of those international treaties. Yes. That said, that said, some of us are only able to support this bill tonight because of the safeguards that are written into it, for example, habeas corpus and others, and I will give way.
Would my honourable friend accept that a number of us are supporting this bill tonight on the basis that when we get to committee and report stage, the government will confirm the legal basis in more detail as to the statement that this complies with our international obligations?
I have great faith in the legal input of the current Attorney General into this bill and into the advice of senior Treasury Counsel. So my honourable friend is right about that, and some of us will be looking to improve the protections in relation to children, in relation to families, in relation to some of the tests, for example, the suspensive serious harm test, and also the compelling circumstances under clause 29 4b. Were it not for things like that, it would be very difficult to support a bill. But they are in there, and we need to build upon those. Yeah. But I also want to make it clear that legislation of itself is not a solution to this. Left on its own, this bill, or no other bill, and any other bill, will not achieve anything. The real need is to operationalise the situation, is to improve the lamentable performance our asylum system and immigration system has had for a number of years. It is ludicrous that immigration tribunals sit empty. Immigration fee-paid part-time judges who were used to surge capacity sit unused because the Home Office is unable to get the files in order to present before the tribunal. If they can't get the cases through the system efficiently and accurately, then that will fail. Secondly, a kind of isolationist unilateralism will not solve an international problem either. Many of us think that the Prime Minister's work on Friday will be every bit as important as any piece of legislation in finding a way forward to get, I hope, a new agreement with France on security, and then a movement to a proper returns policy, because we need a returns policy with friendly and safe countries to make this work. I think the Prime Minister has the seriousness and the tone to achieve that. Finally, we must also make sure that we work swiftly to undertake a sensible approach to the international position, so that we can make sure that our reputation continues to be upheld. The rule of law matters domestically and internationally. That does not mean that you turn a blind eye to organised criminality abusing our hospitality, and that's a real concern to constituents of mine. That's why it's important that we do move forward, but the idea that any piece of legislation alone, without actually those serious operational changes, and frankly the resource to go behind them, is misleading.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just as I think that I cannot be shocked any further by this government's inhumanity, they try to rush this abhorrent and unlawful bill through Parliament. Human rights and legal organisations are calling this one of the most damaging bills put forward by a British government in living memory. This is because the illegal migration bill amounts to a refugee ban. It breaches fundamental and internationally recognised human rights, it attacks our way of life, and it attacks our communities all over the UK. Let us be clear. Persecuting refugees and anti-migrant scaremongering does not benefit the majority of people. The cynical and dangerous use of scapegoating to divide people by an unpopular government which has overseen a horrifying death toll during the pandemic and continues to inflict hardship and suffering across the UK does damage our communities. We have already seen an alarming rise in violence and intimidation organised by the far right against refugees and refugee accommodation. But beyond the rhetoric, spin and fake news, Mr. Speaker, the fundamental point is that most of the people in small boats are men, women and children escaping terror and bloodshed. Chillingly, it is a truth that the government are obviously aware of, because it knows that the majority of people arriving in the UK via boats are granted asylum, and so they are creating a cruel mechanism to deny sanctuary to people they know are legitimate refugees and are in need. And why are migrants being forced into risking their lives in the first place? Well, it's simple. For many, there are no safe routes to the UK. In 2022, half of the men, women and children who crossed the Channel in small boats were from Afghanistan, Eritrea, Iran, Sudan or Syria. We know the reasons why people from such countries are displaced, yet only 22 refugees came to the UK on the Afghan Citizens Resettlement Scheme. How can this be true? And just recently, the government confirmed that it does not intend to introduce any special visa routes for people in Turkey and Syria who have been affected by the earthquakes. As the daughter of migrants who faced violence and persecution from the far right in East London, I am all too conscious of the consequences of pandering to racists. Whether that was the Bangladeshi community standing up and leading the anti-fascist fight back in Brick Lane following the murder of Altab Ali in 1978, or the Jewish community locally who came together in the Battle of Cable Street in 1936, standing up to Oswald Mosley. We know in East London we will never let our communities be divided or targeted. The government should be saving lives, not salvaging their failing political record. We need an approach that prioritises people's lives and dignity. We need safe and legal routes to the UK, and we need this bill thrown out of Parliament.
Tom Randall. Mr. Speaker, we are a rich country. We are the world's 5th largest economy, and we have international obligations, and it is right that we meet them. In 2020, we were the 3rd highest donor to overseas development in the OECD in absolute terms, and the 6th highest as a proportion of gross national income. We have welcomed thousands of people to this country from Syria, Afghanistan, Ukraine and Hong Kong, and whether it's through the government and the taxpayer or through people opening their homes, we have seen the great generosity of the British people. Indeed, I would say that Gary Lineker was correct today to write, as he did on Twitter, that we are a country of predominantly tolerant, welcoming and generous people. But where I think he is wrong, and I think people on the opposing argument are wrong, is that he ignores that tolerance can be tested, and that generosity, while it is deep, it is not limitless. I take a rather hawkish view on immigration. I think that immigration should be in the tens of thousands rather than the hundreds of thousands. But I myself have been surprised by the depth of feeling of Gedling residents on this issue. If I hold a supermarket surgery or if I knock on people's doors, what will be raised with me unprompted, if it's not potholes, it's the issue of boats and migrants. And I think the depth of that feeling is understandable given the context. Albania is a top nationality for small boat arrivals at 25%. And Albania, compared with other countries, is perhaps not one of the major countries facing international issues for which people are requesting asylum. And while there are pull factors, including language and shared history, the passage through multiple safe countries of asylum seekers undermines the idea that the system that we have is one of based on fairness.
Absolutely.
The asylum caseload has doubled since 2014, and an increasing burden on the system is, I think, unfair to those already within the system awaiting a decision. We have seen from numerous television pictures that the arrivals across the Channel are mainly male, whereas I think it would be commonly understood that it is mainly women and children who are the most vulnerable. And it is also wrong, I think, that asylum claims should be granted after a cross-channel migration that puts the role of the smuggler as a de facto part of the asylum process. And I think it is therefore right that we tackle this issue robustly, and I think I can put it no better than the person who put an anonymous note through my door at the weekend, who said, "Dear Mr Randall, I implore you to vote to stop this vile trade. It has to stop, and you and your fellow MPs can make it happen." Well, today, Mr Speaker, I think we can make it happen, and we must stop this vile trade.
Mr Speaker, listening to the honourable gentleman who just sat down, it's difficult to avoid the conclusion that somehow or another we've landed back in much the same